to tweet via Twitter during the trial in court. And it came to our attention last night that Mr. Brockler issued a tweet at 4:51 p.m., which would have been during the cross-examination of Dr. Reed. If I can approach, I'd like to give the court a copy of that tweet.
Yes, have you shown it to Mr. Brockler?
I'll give him a copy.
Okay.
If we could mark that as a court's exhibit, please.
Yes. What number are we up to? 46. 46. Thank you.
And Your Honor, I assume the court issued this order for a good reason, so I will leave it up to the court's discretion what sanction to impose for this violation. I would state, though, that if the prosecution is seeking the execution of a man, perhaps the district attorney should pay attention to the cross-examination of the mental health expert instead of chatting on social media.
Do you want to read for the record what the message or the tweet states?
It states on June 4th,
on social media, and I haven't violated the court's order since it came up. But having said that, the steps that I've taken are to turn off my phone, instruct people if I need to do any business while I'm in court, that they would let me know what it means. And Judge, it's an embarrassing mistake, but one I think I corrected quickly and have put myself in a position to not violate again, and I'm sorry.
Judge, I would note that before the correction, it was retweeted at least 3 times. We have found at least 3 times that that tweet went out from other people. So as the court knows, once it gets out there, it spreads exponentially. And I just think, Dr. Reed was a pretty important witness, and the prosecution should be paying attention to the cross-examination of the witness.
And that's the problem with tweeting something, is that you don't, the attorneys, I should say, to the bench, it was about 4 weeks ago, I'm just estimating, and I specifically said I don't want anyone sending tweets from the courtroom about anything, but obviously much less about the case. Although I didn't specify about the case, I just said about anything, and I think I explained to counsel at the bench that I have prohibited the media from tweeting from the courtroom, and I didn't think it was appropriate then for attorneys to be doing it, especially when proceedings are ongoing. We're not even talking about during breaks, but during actual court proceedings. There's nothing that can't wait until a break or until after court to be tweeted. And sometimes people develop habits, and sometimes they tweet things. I don't have any reason to disbelieve what Mr. Brockler is saying, and so I'm going to take him at his word that he didn't intend to send this as on Twitter, and that he thought it was a text and that this was an inadvertent mistake. And I appreciate him apologizing to the court, but even texting, it seems to me it's something that really should wait until the proceedings are not ongoing. I don't know why email or text can't wait until a break, especially when it's your witness who's testifying and is being cross-examined. So I'm going to prohibit the parties from texting from the courtroom during proceedings. While proceedings are ongoing, counsel should not text. So they should be paying attention to what's happening here. Nobody should be texting, nobody should be emailing, nobody should be reading any electronic communications or sending electronic communications. If you're bored, and I realize that there are 5 attorneys on each side, and sometimes attorneys don't have any witnesses to question, if you're bored and don't want to pay attention to the proceedings, then you're welcome to leave. You don't have to be here. I don't need 5 attorneys on each side. I think I've talked about this before. I don't know that you need 5 attorneys on each side. So if there are attorneys who feel bored, then you don't have to be here. You're welcome to leave. But I think out of respect for the court, when you're in here, you should not be texting or tweeting or doing anything like that. You should be paying attention to what's happening here. So I'm not going to take any action at this time. No action has been requested of the court. Ms. Brady wanted to bring it to the court's attention. We've marked the communication as an exhibit, as a court exhibit, and so it has been marked. I have accepted Mr. Brockler's apology, and I appreciate his candor. But let's avoid it from here on out. All right?
Yes, sir.
Ms. Tisch-McGuire.
Your Honor, I was just going to ask for an exception both for the defense and the prosecution for the sole purpose of just getting witnesses outside the courtroom, just because some of the advocates that are bringing witnesses here only have access to texting on a cell phone. I just wanted to ask for that one exception.
That's fine.
Thank you, Your Honor.
If it's related to that, I understand, and I get that there are a lot of witnesses in this trial. I get that the magnitude of this case requires a lot of logistical arrangements and planning, and so if it's related to that and you have to email someone or text someone and it's related to scheduling or related to witnesses or related to something you need, I understand that, but that shouldn't take very much time and it shouldn't be with a whole lot of frequency. So, but if you're just texting or emailing about what you think or what's going on or other things that are unrelated to the case, that's different. And I understand Mr. Brockler is the elected district attorney of this judicial district. I get it. I'm the chief judge of this judicial district, but I managed to stay off email and text, certainly text. I don't even have my phone here with me on the bench. So if I can stay off of electronic communications for the most part, then so can you, so can everybody here. Again, there are exceptions. There may be situations where for logistical reasons or scheduling reasons or reasons related to witnesses or an emergency, you need to do that. And I've done that a couple of times, but it has to be rare, extremely rare. So, okay.
May I supplement the record one thing?
Yes.
And I did apologize to the court, but I think in light of what the court has said too, I probably owe Mr. King an apology too, and I meant no disrespect, Dan, in doing that, and I apologize to you.
Okay. Thank you. I'm sure Mr. King appreciates that. All right. Is there anything else at this time on behalf of the people?
No, Your Honor.
On behalf of the defense?
Judge, one more thing.
Yes.
And I apologize. I probably should have brought this to the court's attention last night at the close of business, and that was an error in judgment. I'm holding what I've marked as DTR 25 through DTR 52, which are 28 video clips that I described yesterday to the court and indicated that I'd given to Mr. Brockler to review to see if he had any objection to. I emailed him last night indicating asking if he was going to have an objection, and he said that he would. I don't know that I'm going to want to publish all these through Dr. Reed. I am moving to admit them, and if there's an objection, I don't know if it's a foundational objection or some other kind of objection. Obviously, I may need to if there's a foundational objection as to whether they're actually clips of the actual video, I may have to have Dr. Reed watch them all while he's here so I can lay that foundation. So I wanted to bring that to the court's attention now out of the presence of the jury to see what the nature of Mr. Brockler's objection was so that I know how to proceed with the doctor. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Mr. Brockler?
What I believe is that these clips are little segments that were handpicked, cut out of already existing and admitted exhibits. And so my objection would be that they are cumulative and they unnecessarily highlight certain parts, specifically if the jury were to go back and deliberate, as opposed to asking to review an entire portion. They would then be reviewing just the snippet picked by the public defender's office. I do not have an objection to them being published for purposes of efficiency in directing the witness to a specific section of his interview. But I don't think that under any sort of cumulative analysis it makes sense to admit them on top of already admitted videos.
Mr. King, any response?
Well, Judge, I mean, he's correct. They are hand-picked clips that I picked out. I want to be able to use these with other witnesses as well. But I also think there's no reason that they can't be admitted for this jury's consideration. Mr. Brockler has been able to play the entirety of the video. He's been allowed to do that with a somewhat unorthodox procedure at his request and over my objection. And I think that he has the ability to make clips as well to highlight the certain portions that he wishes to highlight for the jury. And I'm just trying to highlight the portions I want to highlight for the jury. So I would move to admit, and if there's not a foundational objection to me then using them with other witnesses, I just wanted to place that on the record.
All right. Well, the exhibit has been admitted. I mean, we have the videotaped in evidence. I think it's entirely appropriate for Mr. King to want to play them when questioning witnesses, but I think to admit the clips, to admit them on top of what's already been admitted, these are copies of the recorded interview, and these are just snippets or clips of that interview. And so to admit all these clips, I think, is cumulative and unnecessary. And I'm not sure that when the jury's deliberating that they're going to get to watch the videotape interview to begin with, much less the clips, even if the clips were admitted. So, Mr. King, that's an explanation for saying I'll let you play them as many times as you want in questioning as many witnesses as you want. Obviously, you can't play it over and over and over again with the same witness, but you can play them as many times as you want with different witnesses. You can ask questions. I think that's all appropriate, but the request to admit them on top of the videotape interview that has already been admitted is denied.
Your Honor, and just, I understand the court's ruling. Before we lose Dr. Reed to the Lone Star State, though, I wanted to make sure there's no additional foundation I need to lay through him.
Your Honor, I am aware that Dr. Reed spent his lunch break yesterday going through these videos. My understanding is he was able to get through, if I could have a moment, Your Honor, 8 of the 20-some-odd clips. So he has not had the ability to review the rest of them yet. But that's all I'd say.
Have you watched them, Mr. Brockler, or has anybody from your team watched them?
No, sir. I believe that they were going to be admitted through Dr. Reed, and I wanted Dr. Reed to watch them to make sure. I have not. And I told the court yesterday, look, as long as they're not subtitled, changed, enhanced in any other way than has already been put on the record, I trust that Mr. King is going to play something that we're all going to look at and say, yeah, we've seen that before.
All right. In that case, I don't think you need to lay any additional foundation.
Thank you.
And Mr. King, what we will do is mark those as court exhibits.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right, let's bring the jury in, please. Please be seated, everyone. Good morning, members of the jury. It's Friday. All right, I'm glad you're happy that it's Friday. Somebody is very happy that it's Friday today. Thank you for returning today. Thank you for being on time. As you know, the plan has been for us to take a late lunch break today. That plan may be changing a little bit because the juror who has a medical appointment may need to leave later than what we had thought. So when I have more concrete details, I'll let you know. But for now, we're planning on taking a late lunch, and then we're hoping that after the lunch, we'll be able to resume the proceedings and we'll be able to go through 5:30. Because we're going to take such a late lunch, we're going to take a couple of breaks this morning, and so we'll probably take a break around 10:15, and then we'll take another break around 11:45 or 12, somewhere along around there. And I think what we'll do is probably just take 15 minutes each time to try to avoid some of the delay, okay? As you know, at the end of the day yesterday, Dr. Reed was on the witness stand, and so Dr. Reed, you may resume the witness stand, and Mr. King was in the middle of his cross-examination. Mr. King, you may resume your cross-examination of Dr. Reed. Dr. Reed, I remind you, sir, that you are still under oath. And before Mr. King proceeds, I want to remind the jury that Dr. Reed's testimony has been admitted only for a limited purpose. You may consider this testimony only as to the issues raised by the defendant's plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. You shall not consider this evidence for any other purpose. As I have mentioned before, please remember that when I refer to the issues raised by the defendant's plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, I am referring to issues related to two questions. Number one, whether the defendant was so diseased or defective in mind at the time of the commission of the act as to be incapable of distinguishing right from wrong with respect to that act. And number two, whether the defendant suffered from a condition of mind caused by a mental disease or defect that prevented him from forming a culpable mental state that is an element of a crime charged in this case. All right, with that instruction in mind, Mr. King, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
Doctor, when we ended up, we had a discussion where you talked about, as a psychiatrist, using the information that you have in light of your experience in clinical expertise or forensic expertise to render diagnoses and the conditions that you felt comfortable doing that, and where you felt comfortable going. And so I'd like to ask just a few questions about your experience, so that the jury can know what your perspective on things is. And I know Mr. Brockler went through this to some degree, and I'm not going to do it ad nauseum, but I just have a few questions for you, if I could.
Sure.
You went to medical school. When did you graduate from medical school, sir?
Graduated from medical school in 1970.
And following medical school, you did some clinical work. Is that correct? Can you describe that for us?
Sure. I went to a combination internship and residency at the University of California at Davis, also known as Sacramento Medical Center. Did that for 3 years, but it was interrupted by military service.
Right. And then when you got out of the military, is it then that you went into private practice?
No, I got out of the military and returned to residency training for another 2 years to complete that, and after graduation from residency, went into private practice.
And that was private practice in your home state of Texas, is that right?
Actually, I went to Santa Fe for 2 years.
Oh, in New Mexico?
Yes.
And after the 2 years, then you moved down to Texas?
Actually, at that point, after 2 years, I went to the University of Nebraska Medical Center in Omaha, where I was on the clinical faculty, for 7 years.
And while you were there, did you see patients?
Oh, yes, saw patients. I ran the residency training program for a while, ran the medical student psychiatry training program for a while, saw both. I did not see inpatients at that point, saw outpatients, and did research.
And what years was that?
That would be 77 to 86. So that would be 9 years. I beg your pardon, not 7 years.
Now, at some point, you did some training in a school of psychoanalysis in Chicago. Is that right? Did that coincide with that period of time?
That coincided with when I was at Nebraska. I thought at that time I wanted to be a psychoanalyst, and commuted to Chicago for about 3.5 years, primarily for my own psychoanalysis and the preliminary work to entering the Chicago Analytic Institute. I did not actually what's called matriculate. I did not take that next step into the Chicago Analytic Institute, completed my analysis, and that was the end of the psychoanalytic training or pre-training period.
So you don't consider, psychoanalysis is kind of a school of psychiatry. Is that fair to say?
Of psychiatry and some other mental health professions. One doesn't have to be a psychiatrist to be a psychoanalyst, but it's a subspecialty or sub-subspecialty of psychotherapy.
And you've used the term psychodynamics here in the courtroom. Psychodynamics is associated with that, is it not?
It's associated with how the psyche works. It's not a psychoanalytic term particularly. Psychodynamics are important to various kinds of psychotherapy and important to psychiatrists and psychologists' understanding of some aspects of our patients or other people.
And you, as you said, you decided not to matriculate, and you don't consider yourself a psychoanalyst, but a lot of those concepts do ring very true for you. Isn't that correct?
That's fair to say, and for a long time I did analytically oriented psychotherapy, or what one might call intensive or psychodynamic psychotherapy. Have not done it for some time.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but psychoanalysis goes all the way back to like Sigmund Freud, right?
He's supposed to have founded the movement, but lots of psychoanalysts are quite different from Freud.
There was a lot of different varieties, and as it goes now, is that right?
Fair to say.
And part of what psychoanalysis involves is the unconscious urges of human beings and the attempts to control that, of the mind to control that, and what Freud described as like the ego and the superego and the id and those kinds of concepts as they're carried forward in time. Is that fair?
If I understand your question, a lot of psychoanalysis and analytically or dynamically oriented psychotherapy, not just psychoanalysis, has to do with accepting the premise that much of what we do and think in our mind is not available to us. It's unconscious, and that unconscious portion is important to the way we feel and how we act.
And would you agree with me that these concepts to some degree are still part of your practice?
They're part of my understanding of people and patients. They're rarely part of my practice right now, but sometimes they are. It depends on the situation.
And you talked in court about the psychodynamic concept with regard to Mr. Holmes' freezing. Is that right? Do you remember that testimony?
Yes.
And I think you said that day that regular folks like those of us in the room would not be aware of this as it happens, but Mr. Holmes is aware of having these thoughts. Is that correct?
That's fair to say. That was my interpretation of what he described to me. Doesn't have to be the only interpretation, but I think it's a logical, to me, interpretation.
And again, we all, psychiatrists are like anyone else. We come from our own backgrounds and experience, correct?
Sure.
Now, so following that period of time, was it then that you went back to Texas, or am I still jumping the gun here?
Yes, you're right. About 1986, I moved back to Texas to enter private practice and work with a small psychiatric hospital in San Antonio.
And you did that until 1989, is that right?
Correct. I was also with the University of Texas Medical Center at that time, but primarily working with a hospital and with a private practice. And in 1989 became the medical director for Texas for mental health and mental retardation.
Right, and so that's kind of sounds like a pretty important job. Fair to say?
It was a nice job to have gotten.
You were in charge of all the, well, tell us what you were in charge of. Why don't you just tell us?
It's fair to say that I headed the medical and psychiatric portion of the mental health enterprise and the mental retardation, now called developmental disabilities, enterprise for the state within the public sector.
And in that capacity, there were a lot of administrative responsibilities, fair to say?
There were.
And you said, I believe during your direct testimony, that during that period of time you might have consulted with other doctors' patients, but you during that period of time didn't have your own patients. Is that fair to say?
That's correct.
And how long were you in that position, sir?
That was the one that was 9 years.
9 years. And following that...
I'm sorry, I beg your pardon. That was the one that was 7 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
So 1989 till about 1996 or so?
Correct.
And then in 1996, you went into private practice and doing mostly forensic work. Is that right?
I went into private practice doing a combination of clinical and forensic work, give or take 50-50, maybe a little less than that forensic. But the private practice was a consultative practice, doing consultations to other clinicians primarily, and a clinical teaching practice. And I don't want to mislead, I'll just go ahead and say I still did not have very many of my own patients that I followed, maybe 3 or 4.
And so since 1989, your clinical work is limited, fair to say.
If one defines clinical as having my own patients that I follow and am responsible for, that's true.
Now, I asked you questions about your work as a defense expert, and I asked you about bias. I had one other topic that I wanted to cover with you, and that was payment. And you're being paid for your work on this case, is that right?
I'm being paid for the time I spend working, and my expenses are being covered.
And are you aware of any doctors that work for free?
Sure.
And any doctors that are working on this case that are working for free?
I'm not aware of any.
And you're
or experts, let me put it that way. I don't know what the fact witnesses may be paid or not paid, but the experts for either side or for the judge, to my knowledge, are receiving probably an hourly compensation of some sort.
And absent you as a psychiatrist deciding to do some pro bono or free work on a given case for any reason, it's normal in the industry for doctors to charge for their services, correct?
Sure.
There's nothing wrong with doing that, correct?
Not as long as the charge is ethical and fairly charged.
And your billing rate is somewhere to the tune of $500 an hour, is that right?
It's $500 an hour with one exception. When I'm reviewing video, not studying the video, I charge about half that rate simply because I may be doing something else as I'm reviewing it. That won't be when I'm reviewing a video for its content, but rather when I'm reviewing a video for its accuracy, or is the whole thing real or something like that. It doesn't seem fair to me to charge full rate to go through things.
Like when you reviewed People's Exhibit, the videotaped examination to make sure that was accurate.
That's a good example. I had already carefully reviewed my video, the video that I made. So this was at least the second time through, and in some areas the third time through. And I just didn't want to charge $500 an hour to do it.
Do you have any idea how much you billed out for on this case so far?
It's been very substantial. Something, I think it's probably between $350,000 and $400,000 over the last, over the total time of my work here.
Thank you. I don't have any more questions about money. And part of the reason that bill is so high, to segue to my next topic, is that the volume of materials in this case is substantial, is it not?
The boxes in my office go to something more than 75,000 pages, plus several hundred DVDs and CDs.
Suffice it to say, it's an enormous amount of material to process and digest and try to remember.
That's fair to say.
Have you ever been given this much material in any case before?
No, I have not.
In truth, is this really more materials than you could have ever reviewed given the time that was allotted for you?
I could have looked at every page in every box and every CD and DVD. As we prioritized things and became aware that some of the things were not relevant to my task or to any of the tasks that the judge asked me to complete, those things were either skimmed quickly or not reviewed. And I'm speaking here of such things as medical records of the victims. There were a few DVDs that I was not able to open. We routinely called prosecution or defense for help with that, and we usually could get them open. But there were things that were not looked at but I believe our prioritization was very reasonable.
You were provided, we, the defense, provided you with materials, and you outlined those in your report, is that right?
Yes,
And the prosecution provided you with materials, correct?
correct.
We actually drove the materials or flew the materials down to where you live in Texas and gave them to you, is that right?
Yes, I recall that.
And a couple
Or some of them anyway, yes. Yeah.
and a couple of agents or representatives from the district attorney's office actually drove their materials down and delivered them to you.
For the most part, that's true.
Now, it was important to you, and is important to you, to review all of the material, all of the relevant material, before seeing Mr. Holmes. Is that right?
It was important to review a lot of it, and sometimes I don't know what's relevant until I open it up. But it was important to review a lot of it prior to the first interview with Mr. Holmes.
And you testified some about that in direct examination. That's part of your practice, is to try to review the history before talking to the patient or the individual you're going to examine. Is that right?
That's fair to say. It's part of my routine.
So that you know what questions you want to ask in general, or what might be relevant issues or areas to explore. Fair to say?
Sure, so the examination can be guided, guided and efficient and effective.
And so that you can use your clinical experience to compare what the person is saying to you with what's in the record for consistency, et cetera, like we discussed yesterday.
That's one of the reasons, sure.
Now, you said that, in fact, I believe you testified that the only time you would want to rush in and immediately see the individual would be if you could have access to the person right after the event took place. Am I understanding your testimony?
Yes, the importance of seeing the person as early as possible to the event can outweigh the need to gather lots and lots of information before one sees him.
And so when you're in that scenario, you kind of go in blind, right, and see what happens.
That's not a bad way of putting it. You're somewhat blind. You usually have information from only one party, usually the defense. And one doesn't do that, by the way, as a matter of ethics. One doesn't do that until counsel has been appointed.
So you wouldn't just go down to the jail when someone was arrested and try to get in and talk to them?
That's correct. That would be unethical.
And you said that despite your preference to have reviewed all the materials, in that scenario you would go in without doing that because the value outweighs whatever else is a consideration. Is that correct?
The value of that part. Now, one would expect that after that you would review, and you very well might see the person again or more than once after that. But to get that part of the evaluation, that's a good way to do it.
Why is that so valuable, to see the person right after the event? Why would that be so valuable?
Because we're talking about a person's mental condition on the day, in this case, the day of a shooting. The most relevant information, the most relevant times regarding that mental condition are during the shooting, just before, and just after. There are some nuances of that, but if one can see him 10 seconds, 10 minutes, 10 hours, or a day or two afterward, the inference, and I think it's a good inference, is that you're more likely to see him as he was during the incident than you are if you see him, in my case, 2 years later.
And so you would not run the risk or the problems that we described yesterday, where the person may be at a later time having difficulty recollecting the way they were thinking in that state when the event took place.
You would avoid some problems. There are some problems. For example, people often act differently after events, even right after events, than they were acting during the events. After all, they've finished the event, they've gone through an arrest or something like that. But in general, your statement's correct.
In general, the quicker you can get in there is the best.
Yes.
Now, if you were to be sent in, and I realize this is a hypothetical situation, so tell me if you're comfortable answering this. If you were to be sent in that type of a scenario, retained by an attorney, and asked to see a defendant and to just report on what you saw, something along those lines, would you then immediately render an opinion about whether the individual was sane or not without reviewing any of the materials of the history?
Okay. First of all, if I were to be sent in or asked to go in by, for example, a defense attorney, I would have some preparation and would try very hard to do a complete examination at that time from a forensic viewpoint. That includes some clinical things, but I would see myself as a forensic psychiatrist, not the person's treating psychiatrist, of course. I would go through my regular examination routine, would try very hard to do the examination alone, although there may be security reasons not to be able to do that. I might well talk with the attorney about what I found or what I saw, but those would be preliminary thoughts, and I would be telling the attorney, let's look at other things before I offer any opinions to you.
Because it really wouldn't be appropriate to render an opinion without reviewing the history, fair to say?
Without reviewing at least some of it. I can give you an impression, I can tell you what direction it might go, but I'm not ready to write a report, for example.
Now, you were asked by Mr. Brockler some questions about Dr. Woodcock, is that right?
I'm pretty sure I was.
In this case, you were not able to see Mr. Holmes immediately after the shooting. You weren't involved in the case and you were in Texas, right?
That's true.
But Dr. Woodcock was available, as far as you know, because he did go see him. Is that right?
That's my understanding, yes.
And that was on the 23rd of July. Is that your understanding?
The date is not clear to me because there are a couple of different dates, but it was at least before the 24th and around the 23rd or 24th. There was a possibility in my mind that it was the 21st, but I don't think that's true. So I'll accept that as a probable date.
Okay.
It was certainly within 3 or 4 days.
Okay. I think that's fair. And you know that we hired him to go talk to Mr. Holmes, right?
That's my understanding.
And you don't know why we decided to hire him.
I don't know what was on your mind.
You don't know what we asked him to do that day, do you?
I don't think anybody ever told me. If he told me in my conversation with him, I don't recall.
You don't know what questions we asked him to answer for us or what our directions were, fair to say?
I don't recall as I sit here and probably never knew.
And following that, you received notes, the notes that Dr. Woodcock took during that interview, is that right?
A couple of years later, yes.
And you were able to discuss that with him?
Yes.
And he gave his initial impressions about a possible diagnosis, is that right?
Yes, and I'm trying to think whether they were contemporaneous notes. Were they taken while he was with the defendant? Were they written down just after? I'm not recalling the date of the notes, but there certainly were notes, and I was able to talk with him. He was nice enough to talk with me about that experience.
Okay. And his initial impression or thought about diagnosis was that it could be a schizoaffective disorder, was his thought. Is that right?
I recall that was one of the things he wrote down, yeah.
And that's within the schizophrenia spectrum of disorders that you and the other doctors have diagnosed as well.
Yes, it's far out on the right of that spectrum, yes.
And he didn't, as Mr. Brockler pointed out on direct examination, Dr. Woodcock did not at that point render any opinion about sanity or capacity. Is that right?
I don't recall one way or the other whether he did. I can look at my notes and at his notes. Let me just leave it at I don't recall.
Okay. But you have subsequently received a report from Dr. Woodcock fairly recently, this year, correct?
Yes.
and you are aware that he has the diagnosis is schizoaffective disorder in his opinion. It remains the same opinion. Is that right?
I believe you're correct.
And he's opined that Mr. Holmes was insane or lacked the capacity to distinguish between right or wrong or to form the required mental state. Is that correct?
That's what his report said, yes. Excuse me.
Among the materials that you reviewed were some videos from the jail. Is that right?
Yes.
Excuse me. Now, you got a few videos that related to the events that took place in November, several weeks later, or a couple months later, following the arrest. Is that right?
Yes.
And those would be videos involving Mr. Holmes being in a BC room in the medical unit at the jail, right?
Part of them were of his regular cell, and some of them were in the BC unit or behavior control unit.
And you were able to actually view those areas, were you not?
Yes, I saw them in person, I think a bit later when I visited the jail.
And that's something you do as part of your practice too, is try to do like site visits.
I try to. I don't always accomplish that, but I thought it was important in this case.
And you did a site visit of the where the theater is too, right?
Yes, did not go inside, drove around it.
Because it had been remodeled anyways at that point.
Exactly.
And you went to the Paris Street location, 6090 Paris Street, is that right?
I did not. That's his apartment, right?
Yes, sir.
I don't believe I drove there.
Okay. So that maybe wasn't as valuable as you hoped it would do, but you still make an attempt to go to the site. Fair enough?
Fair enough.
And when you went to the jail, that was when you asked me to introduce you to Mr. Holmes, fair to say?
Yes, I went to the Aurora lockup and then to the jail, and as long as I was there and knowing that at some point I was going to see Mr. Holmes, I asked you if I could simply be introduced to him so I wouldn't be a surprise when he finally met me later.
And you and I were able to, we were escorted around to the three different locations, is that right?
Yes.
And we went to Mr. Holmes' cell in the medical unit, the MC cell, where he normally is located, correct?
Correct.
And from your information, he's been in that cell since his arrest, correct?
At that point, that's correct. I don't know whether he's still in the same cell, but yes.
And we're going to talk about the jail videos in a moment, but you're aware that Mr. Holmes, since his arrest, has been isolated, meaning he's not in general population with other inmates.
Correct.
He is alone 23 hours a day in that cell. Is that right?
At least. Sometimes he doesn't want to go out, I understand, and never mixes with other inmates.
He's allowed to leave the cell for an hour a day if he wants to shower or to go. There's a room next door where there's a little television and he can watch television or read or something. Is that right?
Yes, and there's a yard that he can go into if he chooses to, kind of a Stark exercise yard.
And the Stark exercise yard is just a kind of a square about the size of the well of this court with pavement on the bottom and concrete walls and a grill over the top.
That's my memory too.
And the other place that we visited was the BC cell that we talked about before, and that's the place that Mr. Holmes was placed during that difficult period when he had the psychotic break in November, correct?
Correct.
Now this cell is also in the medical unit in the jail, right?
It was very close. I don't know how the jail says it, but it was a short distance away from the MC cell.
And these BC cells are they're kind of like rubberized rooms. Fair to say, not really soft rubber, but there's rubber on the walls of the rooms. Is that right?
Yes, and I appreciate your saying it's not really soft rubber. It's just not very soft rubber. It's just not concrete.
Now, in Mr. Holmes's cell that he's normally in, there's a toilet in there and a sink on top of it. Is that right?
Yes.
And there's a bunk, kind of a hard steel bunk with a mattress on it.
Yes.
A thin mattress. And I think we may be able to see, the jury may see photos of that cell later. But, and he's allowed to have a book in there to read and other picture of his family, things like that. Is that right?
Yeah, there are two picture areas outlined on the wall where you can put pictures that are approved. He can have, I think, roughly a dishpan full of personal effects that have been approved. It's a pretty standard modern jail cell, isolation jail cell.
And the BC, the rubberized room, doesn't have a toilet in it or a bed, does it?
That's correct.
And when folks are in there, they don't have their normal jail clothes on. They're given kind of a suicide gown if there's a suicide concern. Is that right?
I assume that's common. All I know is that Mr. Holmes was not allowed clothing. He was given a gown, which, once again, I assume was a special kind of thing, commonly called a suicide gown, that's difficult to tear, difficult to hurt yourself with, and was also given a blanket.
And there's no sink in there either. Is that right?
There's no sink. The only thing, the only break in the floor is a good-sized drain in the center.
And the videos that you got from November in 2012 are basically 3 videos, and correct me if you don't recall these, but there's, there's one video where he's in his regular cell and he does this, what I'm going to call a trust fall off the bunk there, where he kind of falls backwards in his cell. Is that fair?
I remember that video, yes.
Then there's another video where he's in the behavioral control cell and he's naked on the floor on a blanket, and the deputies come in and they drag him out from that cell, and you can see there are feces in the cell. Is that right?
That's fair to say. The video or videos shows more things, but part of it was he apparently wouldn't come out on his own. They dragged him on the blanket, I guess, out of the cell.
And you don't know whether that was because he wouldn't, because he didn't want to, or because he couldn't, do you?
I don't know. I want to make it clear that I didn't see any cruelty on behalf of the correction staff, but he either wouldn't or couldn't get up and walk out of the cell as they wanted.
Now, there's no doubt in your mind, sir. You talked yesterday about your opinions about Mr. Holmes being floridly psychotic or not being so, in your opinion, on July 20th. There's no doubt in your mind, is there, that he was psychotic at that point in time in November?
Around November 12 or so, when he was taken to the BC cell, and when he came back to the BC cell within a few hours, I think, that period of time in November.
And that was shortly after that, a few days after that, was when he was taken to Denver Health Medical Center and treated in the psych ward there.
Yes, I think first in the emergency room. I'm not sure whether he went to critical care, but eventually was in what I assume was a psychiatric unit, in some sort of setting that could be secure.
And he was diagnosed by the physicians there with psychosis NOS, psychosis not otherwise specified, right?
I don't remember the specifics of that. I remember different physicians in different places, certainly all agreeing to psychosis, and the nuances or the sub-causes of the psychosis varied.
And part of it was that he had stopped drinking or eating a lot, at least in part, the days previous, and that contributed to the condition as well, right?
Yes, according to the doctors, and I have no reason to doubt that.
And the doctors at Denver Health indicated that when he got there, they were able to rehydrate him, and whatever dehydration or delirium cleared up fairly quickly. Is that right?
That's right.
We're going to talk a little bit later about them treating his psychiatric symptoms there. But there's no doubt in your mind during that period of time that Mr. Holmes was seeing hallucinations. He was experiencing audio hallucinations. Is that right?
He appeared to be. He told other people, and although I wasn't there, I don't have any doubt that he was acutely psychotic. that is significantly out of contact with reality.
And the third video that you got from that period of time was the one where he kind of runs his head into the wall, and then he's doing some waving his arms around a little bit. The jury's seen it, and I don't want to mischaracterize it, but some fairly odd behaviors, and he's naked in the cell.
I recall the videos, they were odd behaviors, and to some extent they were self-destructive behaviors.
And during that period of time, you're aware from the records that he was smearing feces on himself, talking gibberish, immobile at times, a number of different symptoms.
I couldn't hear him talking the gibberish, but that was reported. I saw the feces both on the floor. The video wasn't good enough for me to see it on himself, but that was reported as well, and I don't doubt it.
Not a very fun situation.
A terrible situation.
Mental illness can at times be difficult. Fair to say?
Sure.
You also received from the jail surveillance videos, I'm going to call them for want of a better word, videos that were of him in his cell, and then him if he were moved somewhere in the jail, correct?
Correct.
And these are kind of grainy, you said, right?
Yes, they're taken by the ones in the cell taken by a camera apparently up in a corner. It doesn't zoom in, but one can recognize the situation and generally recognize Mr. Holmes.
And you were given, well, there were about 30 days or so of videos of 24-hour surveillance, right?
Something like that.
Starting with his arrest on the 20th of July.
Starting with whenever the first day he was in that cell, yeah.
And ending somewhere right at the end of August, like August 30th, somewhere around.
I'll trust you to say when that was. I might have said it a little further, but I'll trust you to say when that was.
And at that point, the jail stopped collecting the videos. Is that right?
So far as I know, they stopped saving the videos. I want to say, although I'm trying to think if someone has specifically told me this, that the video was active, but they stopped saving the videos, which makes sense because they had video of the day that he was falling backward off the bunk.
Right. When they chose to pull the video later, it existed. When they chose to save it. Fair to say?
I think that's fair to say.
And you don't know why they stopped recording, Mr. Holmes, do you?
No, no.
Do you know whether or not we, the defense, had requested that they videotape Mr. Holmes?
Sustained.
Now, I think you testified that you viewed 7 to 10 days of the videos. Is that right? Was that your testimony?
It might not have been 7 to 10 days. It was several days. I don't recall exactly how many days. I could go to my notes and tell you.
I can tell you where it is if that helps.
If the notes, I said I could go to my notes. They would be back at the hotel, that particular, but
Do you have your report with you?
yes, I have.
Look on page 25, the bottom of the page, footnote 45.
Sure, would you like for me to read it?
Yes, sir.
On page 25, footnote 45, I did not watch all available hours of jail video, but covered his first 3 days in jail, then randomly chose others, July 30, August 16, and all available video of the day his, quote, fall, unquote, and time in the, quote, BC cell. All other jail video had been erased except July 10, 2014, which I requested in advance to observe a representative recent day of monitoring. What that has to do with was when I was coming to see him in person, I asked the jail to preserve a random day so that I could see what his day in that cell looked like before I saw him.
Right. So you, so from the video of the first month, it sounds like you reviewed 5 days. Am I correct? The first 3 days and then 2 other days.
That's correct.
And you said during your direct testimony with Mr. Brockler that in your review of those, you didn't see anything, I think the term you used was psychiatrically significant. Is that right?
If that's a term I used, that sounds logical. And once again, it's not video in which I can hear things, but that's a true statement.
And you certainly that video is not high quality. Is that right?
It's not high quality. It's not terribly low quality. It's a picture of somebody in his small room, day and night.
And you saw him eat during that period of time,
Yes.
right? You saw him sit on his bed quite a bit,
Yes.
just sitting there. Read some.
Yes.
People who are mentally ill can often do normal everyday activities. Is that right?
They can, C-A-N, often do normal activities.
Feed themselves, right?
Sure.
Go shopping at the grocery store.
Sure.
Drive a car.
Sure. Many do. Most do.
Yeah, there's nothing that would preclude you. Not everyone who has a serious mental illness is homeless and drooling on the streets. Fair to say?
Very fair to say.
And part of that has to do with how intelligent a person can be or what kind of capacity the person has to begin with. Fair?
I think little of that has to do with the intelligence. A lot of it has to do with whether the person's being treated or being adequately treated or accepting treatment. If that's responsive to your question.
And you can't tell from looking at you didn't see anything that stood out as being really odd to you in the 5 days that you watched. Is that right?
I saw a person who was fairly stiff, but nothing bizarre or indicating anything like what I saw in the November videos.
Right. And suffice it to say, you don't know what's in the videos you didn't watch. I guess that's pretty obvious.
That's fair to say.
You never saw...
I'm sorry, except to the extent that the correctional staff logs and the medical staff logs may reflect something like that. But obviously I did not see any videos.
Okay. So you don't recall ever seeing any videos of Mr. Holmes, like, plucking his hair out? You don't remember that?
I don't recall that.
You don't recall ever seeing any videos of Mr. Holmes trying to listen to the walls of his cell?
Certainly not prior to November 11, I believe.
Okay. You're not aware of a circumstance where he had a water bottle and he was supposedly trying to start a fire with the sunlight coming in through the window somehow? Are you aware of that?
It sounds a little familiar based on the logs, because when the correctional staff would see or find something unusual, they would, one hopes, log that, and I read those. I'm not remembering as I sit here, but it sounds kind of familiar.
Do you remember some of those logs reflecting that Mr. Holmes was dancing around in his cell?
I don't recall. I recall him juggling a little bit and playing with a hacky sack.
Right, that too. So, you know, it's very difficult to tell from looking at those videos what's going on inside Mr. Holmes' mind. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say.
Let's talk a little bit about your then contact with Mr. Holmes. That's a good kind of segue too, is you brought up the fact that when you went and visited him, you requested that you get another day of video from the jail to kind of sample what his daily life was during that period of time.
Yes. You
videotaped, obviously, I think that's very obvious to this jury at this point that you videotaped all of your contact with Mr. Holmes.
Yes, except for the initial introduction that you made.
And all we did was just, I said, this is Dr. Reed, he's going to be coming to talk to you, right?
Right, and I said hello, shook his hand, and that was it.
Now, fair to say, different psychiatrists have different practices of how they approach their examinations.
Fair to say.
Kind of an idiosyncratic lot sometimes, you think, or?
Not strictly idiosyncratic. I think we all try to create and structure examinations so that we will get the necessary information if we can, so that the examination or the examination should be complete, private, things like that are, I think, common to the great majority of forensic psychiatrists, but there are differences in style, certainly.
And that's exactly where I was going to go with this, is that you do what works best for you based on your experience to accomplish the goals of gathering and recording the information that you need from those clinical interviews.
Part of it is what works best for me, and part of it is what I think constitutes a solid examination. So there are kind of two purposes. If what worked best for me didn't constitute what I believe is good practice of my profession, then that wouldn't matter. So the two need to be there.
Gotcha. Some doctors take notes when they're in the interview. Some doctors take the notes after the interview. Fair to say?
Except for those who are recording one way or another, I believe the great majority take notes during the interview. There are some who take notes afterward, and it's not uncommon for therapists to write down notes after sessions, but those aren't forensic folks.
Some doctors may audio tape, right?
Some do. Nowadays, videotape is, I think, the preferred way to go, but some audio tape.
And there's some literature out there, and that some psychiatrists have some concern with videotaping examinations, right?
There is a little video out there. I'm thinking of one study in particular, but there is very little literature suggesting that video examinations are problematic, and a much greater bulk of literature that suggests or indicates, in my view, that videoing an examination is a very good thing to do.
And the concern, just to get it out there, is that the person may play act for the camera or behave differently or respond differently somehow, or that the clinician may respond differently or act differently because they know they're on videotape.
And those are things that are raised. The study I'm thinking of was one in which the camera was rather intrusive, but still the concerns are there. Will people play to the camera, including the evaluator?
In your opinion, those concerns are de minimis?
Compared to the advantages, I believe so. Now, another piece of this is that people in legal cases, whether civil cases or criminal cases, attorneys may or may not want audio or video to occur, and they may have legal reason, or I suppose constitutional reason, to be able to prevent that. My job is to do the best evaluation I can. I think most forensic psychiatrists feel the same way. And so I would advocate for doing it, quote, my way, understanding that sometimes there are legal things that get in the way of that, and I may not be able to.
The benefits that you describe are in accurately recording the examination, the questions and the answers, right?
That's a major benefit.
And being able to record the demeanor, affect, and presentation of the examinee.
That's a major benefit.
So the video, in your opinion, then, is the most accurate statement or recitation of your examination, of the contents of your examination of Mr. Holmes' statements to you, right?
I think that statement is true true. I'm trying to think. You said most accurate. It's better than simply taking notes, better than simply relying on my memory or someone like me's memory, better than relying on my interpretations as I write down something and then it comes to the report or to court second or third hand. It's just very useful in my opinion. And that doesn't mean I always do it or that I always can do it.
But you did do it in this case, obviously.
In this case, I did.
Let's talk briefly about the DSM-5. The DSM-5, as you described it, it's a manual for clinicians, mental health clinicians, right?
Yes.
And it contains all kinds of different mental disorders in here, all kinds of things.
Yes.
Serious mental disorders and not so serious sometimes.
Correct.
And is this some kind of is this like a mathematical formula that's always correct in diagnosing people if you follow this book?
For the most part, not. There may be some very, very specific formulaic ways to approach some diagnoses, and it attempts to be very specific, but it's not an end-all for clinical diagnosis. The most important thing is the patient you're presented with.
Right. And what it kind of is a way of categorizing, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't want to misstate it, but a way of categorizing symptoms so that different physicians or clinicians are talking about the same thing. In other words, the same collection of symptoms.
That's a big purpose, and that's one of the things the American Psychiatric Association has tried to accomplish for over the last 60, 70 years.
And you said that the DSM-4 was a very reliable manual in your opinion, and that was the one that you, I think, wrote about how to use, correct?
The DSM-4, the predecessor to this, and what's called the DSM-4 TR, which was a kind of an interim edition, I believe were good examples for their purpose, which was similar to DSM-5's. Things evolve. My involvement with DSM-4, I don't want to overstate it. I've been involved in training people to use it as part of training people to accurately diagnose patients. I certainly wouldn't say that I wrote that book or something like that.
This book right here.
Or the 4.
And it's written, and I think you testified about this on direct examination, it's written by committees or task force of different clinicians of different types that get together and together write the different sections. Is that right?
Sure. Task forces of clinicians who specialize or subspecialize in the various categories. They range from heavily research-oriented folks to heavily clinically oriented folks. There's a bit of practicality thrown in. It's a complicated process. It took the APA, give or take, a decade to come up with it.
Were you involved in any of the committees or groups that wrote the sections in this book?
No, I wasn't.
And the diagnoses that we've talked about, schizotypal personality disorder, is mentioned in the section called schizophrenia, spectrum, and other psychotic disorders. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
And that has schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder, as well as delusional disorder. Is that right?
Yes.
And are you aware whether Dr. Gurr was involved in the committee that wrote this section?
I'm not aware.
When did the DSM-4 that you taught, and you said you taught it in, I think, China, Europe, Canada, and the United States, is that right?
To some extent. Again, I don't want to overstate that, but I've lectured about it, done workshops about it in different places.
And that was published in the mid-1980s, did you say?
The DSM-4, the first edition, I want to say 83, that may be wrong.
I'm going to mark this, with your permission, Your Honor, as DTR 25. And ma'am, this is 2622. I'll show it to the prosecutor.
Thank you.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
Sir, I'm handing you what I've marked as DTR-25. Can you just take a look at that for me, please?
Sure.
Do you recognize that?
It's a page from one of the DSMs, and as I sit here, I'm not sure whether it's DSM-4 or DSM-5.
And that's a page that talks about what we just described, the schizophrenia spectrum.
Oh, yeah, this is the first page of the DSM-5 section on schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders.
Judge, I've moved the admission of D-TR-25.
Yes. All right, Mr. King, you may proceed as we agreed at the bench.
Can I have that on the screen, please, ma'am? And can you zoom in on that top paragraph there, if possible? Can you read that for us, doctor?
Sure. Schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders include schizophrenia, other psychotic disorders, and schizotypal (personality) disorder. They are defined by abnormalities in one or more of the following 5 domains: delusions, hallucinations, disorganized thinking (speech), grossly disorganized or abnormal motor behavior, including catatonia, and negative symptoms.
Thank you. You can take down the call out. And then it has descriptions under that of the, it says key features that define the psychotic disorders. Is that right?
Yes.
All of these disorders in this category involve psychosis to some degree.
To some degree, yes.
That's why they're in this section, right?
Yes.
Delusions there. Can we zoom in on that first sentence of the delusions, please? And the delusions involve what, sir? Can you read that first sentence there,
Sure.
please?
The first sentence alone says, delusions are fixed beliefs that are not amenable to change in light of conflicting evidence. Their contact may include a variety of themes, such as persecutory, referential, somatic, religious, grandiose.
Thank you. And we could talk about some of those things, and I think you did that yesterday. Persecutory delusions would be some kind of like a paranoia. You think someone's after you, something along those lines. Fair to say?
Yes.
Somatic means some kind of body concern or illness that you think, I think I've got cancer, but I don't really have it, something along those lines. Is
If
that
you're
right?
convinced, even though there's evidence to the contrary, yes.
And that's the other thing I want to bring up. The other component of delusions is that they have to be false beliefs. In other words, they're things that are not true in fact, but the person believes that they are.
The person believes they're true and generally believes that they're real, in the sense that if other people don't believe them, there's something wrong with the other people, or the belief is somehow hidden from them.
And delusions, either you or Mr. Brockler gave the example of the King of France or the Princess of an Island or something like that, of Mars or something.
Something like that.
Yesterday. Now, if I think I'm the King of France, that's a delusion because I'm not, correct?
If you truly believe that you are, and we can't shake that belief, that would be accurate.
In other words, if I walk around in normal life, and, well, let's say this, for example, I may think that everyone else thinks I'm the King of France too, right?
You might.
Or I might think that I'm the only person that knows, right?
That you're the only person who knows, even though you believe it's real. That's correct.
Right. And I may walk around in the world, and despite the fact that nobody else, despite the fact that everyone treats me like dirt, I still think I'm the King of France, right?
That's conceivable.
That's a delusion.
That's a conceivable kind of delusion, yes.
Now, another thing that was on there was negative symptoms. Hallucinations we talked about, right? You
I believe
talked about quite a bit, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. But so these are all symptoms of psychosis in some fashion, correct?
Symptoms consistent with psychosis, yes.
And disorganized thoughts or speech is also a symptom, correct?
Consistent with psychosis, yes.
What are negative symptoms, sir?
Negative symptoms are things, let me start with the, quote, positive symptom business. A positive symptom is something that somebody does or talks about. A negative symptom is something that somebody doesn't do or talk about. So that a common manifestation of negative symptoms in a person, for example, with schizophrenia, is not much talking, not much movement, not much expression or affect, not much showing of mood, not much moving around. I think I already mentioned that. Sometimes going so far as to be in a sort of a stupor.
Now, for someone with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, for example,
Excuse me.
Negative symptoms are as real symptoms as positive symptoms are, correct? They just present differently.
Given the overall constellation of schizophrenia, it's a genuine group of symptoms.
And it's quite common that the negative symptoms precede the positive symptoms, correct?
It's common. The way one often sees them is once the positive symptoms, that is, hallucinations and odd behavior, have been treated, the negative symptoms often remain and are more difficult to get rid of.
And we'll talk about medication in a little while and how that affects both types. But the period of time, and you used this word prodromal yesterday with me, the period of time for someone with schizophrenia when they have negative symptoms but prior to the onset of the positive or psychotic symptoms is called the prodrome or the prodromal period. Is that right?
I don't want to imply that everybody has negative symptoms and then develops positive symptoms. I think one of the things that you may be talking about is an older term, that there is a process in which the person may not look, I'm going to use the word crazy. I promise I don't mean it in a derogatory way, may not look unusual or particularly unusual, but doesn't have the apparent hallucinations or major delusions and things like that. Some patients have that kind of life for a while, for years sometimes, before they show the more obvious symptoms of schizophrenia. other patients or people don't have very much evidence at all that a break is coming, and the break is more sudden.
So, sir, for some people, they may have these negative symptoms for even years before the onset of active psychosis, right?
That's true, and you're using the word negative. That may be a very accurate term. It's just not the one that I would use. But I think we're talking about the same concept. The person is progressively not getting along well in the world, not thinking adequately, has disorganized thinking, but is not acutely out of contact with reality.
Well, I want to check on the things listed here because I don't. Disorganized thinking is listed as a positive symptom. Is that right in the DSM-5?
If it's, I'm trying to think whether it's phrased a positive symptom, but it's one of the main possible categories of symptoms.
Okay. I'm going to read from here. Two of the negative symptoms that are particularly prominent in schizophrenia are diminished emotional expression and avolition, correct?
Yes, avolition meaning not doing very much and not wanting to do very much, just not wanting to do things.
Diminished emotional expression includes reductions in the expressions of emotions in the face, eye contact, intonation of speech, movements of the hands, head, face that normally give emotional emphasis to speech, correct?
That's fair to say, and it sounds like you're reading from one of the pages that may become an exhibit pretty soon.
Avolition is a decrease in motivated, self-initiated, purposeful activities, correct?
Correct. I think that's a good definition of it.
Lack of motivation.
A lack or decrease in self-motivated acts and behaviors.
And you're aware from some of the reports that you received from Mr. Holmes's professors and other students at CU that they thought that he appeared unmotivated in some of his labs. Is that right?
Some did, yes.
And they reported him as having a difficulty communicating and not speaking very much, correct?
That was true for a lot of them that said that.
Alogia. Am I pronouncing that right?
Yeah. Alogia is not talking.
Diminished speech output, right?
Talking less.
Anhedonia.
Not being able to experience pleasure.
Asociality.
Not being able to or not experiencing social things, interactions with other people.
Those are all symptoms of schizophrenia, is that right?
And of other things as well, yes.
Now,
And let me clarify, not every schizophrenic person has all of those all of the time, but you're correct that they are all consistent with a diagnosis of schizophrenia.
I want to, just on that asociality point, I want to bring something else up as a slight aside. And that is, there's something called being, as opposed to asocial, being antisocial. Is that right?
Yes, I and most people like me draw a distinction between those two things.
Well, what is antisocial in the context of like antisocial? And I just want to be clear, Holmes does not have antisocial personality disorder, right?
That's correct. I have no doubt that he does not have antisocial personality,
And you have no doubt that he's not a psychopath.
which would rise from what I just said. He is not clinically defined at all as a psychopath.
Schizotypal personality disorder is one of these schizophrenia spectrum disorders, and that's the one of them that you diagnosed Mr. Holmes with, correct?
Yes.
In your opinion, the schizotypal personality disorder first showed up in Mr. Holmes before he was even in graduate school, right?
At least the beginnings of it showed up, the hints of it showed up. I don't know the day or the month or the year that he met all the diagnostic criteria, but it's a chronic thing, a long-standing thing, rather than something that starts last week.
Right. It's not like you wake up one morning and all of a sudden you've got schizophrenia and you're nuts. Normally, there's a progression that takes place. Is that right?
There usually is a progression. Sometimes it is not visible, and sometimes there is a day that you're not schizophrenic and the next day you are with an acute break. That's one way it can happen.
Understood. And in your opinion, the symptoms that relate to his schizotypal personality disorder extend back into when he was in high school. Is that right?
Some of those symptoms appear to do so.
Odd beliefs and magical thinking are symptoms of schizotypal personality disorder.
They are possible symptoms of it.
Chronic thoughts or delusions can be. Is that right?
I'm going to, just so that I'm tracking with you.
Go ahead.
And not, because I always want to be accurate and my memory's not great. I believe you were at the, let me ask you to restate it if you would.
Sure. Chronic thoughts or delusions that others' words or actions refer to yourself, like an idea of reference or a delusion of reference?
Actually, I struck that from my report, because you're reading from my report and not now from the DSM, because I made an error in transcribing what was in the DSM, so that while delusions may be present, they're not a primary part of the schizotypal personality, and certain kinds of delusions are not part of the criteria for schizotypal personality. I believe I sent an error notice to both parties about that.
That's right. And we'll talk about because you also diagnosed a possible delusional disorder in addition, correct?
Yes.
Unusual perceptual experiences, including bodily illusions, right?
Correct.
Odd thinking in speech, right?
Correct.
Suspiciousness or paranoid thinking, correct?
Correct.
Inappropriate or constricted affect.
Correct.
That sounds a lot like the negative symptom we just described, or similar.
And it's, I'm glad you brought that up. It's important to note that the overlap in certain kinds of symptoms is real common in psychiatry. It's common in other medical specialties as well, just as a stomachache can be a symptom of one thing and a symptom of something else. The constellation of everything going on and what the clinician best interprets the best fit to be becomes the diagnosis or the working diagnosis or the presumptive diagnosis.
And you note that in your report, where you say only a small portion of people with schizotypal personality disorder go on to develop schizophrenia or other similar conditions, correct?
Most do not. The flip side of that, which is also in the report and maybe the same sentence, is that once a person is schizophrenic, it's relatively common to see the symptoms of schizotypal disorder, which may be called something else, preceding that diagnosis when you look back.
As like the prodromal period.
Exactly.
So if you take schizotypal personality disorder and then the person becomes psychotic, overtly psychotic, it kind of is then schizophrenia.
Sometimes it is. I don't mean to get too vague and nuanced here. Being psychotic doesn't define one being schizophrenic, but it's a real important thing to happen. If one becomes more reliably diagnosed as schizophrenic, then we can look back, and if he was schizotypal 2 years before or 6 months before, it's reasonable to say that that was a prodromal set of symptoms or an incipient set of symptoms, or simply that the schizotypal personality disorder has evolved, in this case, into schizophrenia. They're all very similar ways of looking at it.
The course of schizotypal personality disorder is chronic and lifelong.
Yes.
There's no cure for schizotypal personality disorder.
Not to my knowledge.
There's no cure for schizophrenia.
Not to my knowledge.
There's no cure for schizoaffective disorder, is there?
Not to my knowledge.
Now, folks with these disorders, however, depending on the severity of them, if treated, can lead from time to time fairly normal lives.
Many of them can. Some lead abysmal lives, unfortunately. Some lead, a few lead fairly symptom-free lives, not a great many, but a few, given adequate treatment and adequate care. Most folks fall somewhere in the middle.
Mr. King, I don't mean to interrupt you, but whenever you get to a point where it makes sense to take our morning break, would you please let me know?
This is fine, Judge, if you'd like.
Okay, is that okay with you?
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you. All right, folks, let's go ahead and take our morning break. Please remember all my advisements apply during the break. Let's take 15 minutes, okay? Enjoy the break. Thank you. Please be seated, everyone. The record should reflect that the jury has exited the courtroom. Is there anything that we need to talk about before we take the break?
Could I just make a brief inquiry, Your Honor?
Yes.
Assuming the plan is we'll take at least one more break in the morning session since we're going longer.
At least one more, yeah. And I'll have more information about when the lunch break is going to be, hopefully after the break.
Thank you, Your Honor. A couple of us may have to leave to try to figure out logistics after that happens.
Okay, thank you. Anything on behalf of the defense, Mr. King?
No, Judge.
Okay, enjoy the break. Doctor, I'll see you after the break. The court will be in recess.